Welcome to episode 4 of Let's Talk WEM, the podcast series from CIWEM which keeps you right up to date with current issues in the world of water and environmental management, talks to key figures across our industry and takes a deep dive into some of the biggest challenges and topics we're all facing at the moment. We're grateful to our series sponsor, Yorkshire Water, for helping us to share these conversations and bring this podcast idea to life. I'm Niki Roach, I'm the President of CIWEM, and the theme of my presidency is Everything is Connected. Themes like storytelling and the power of individual and authentic connections have come out in each episode so far in the series, and we've covered a breadth of topics: advocacy, flooding and pride. Each episode, joining me to give opinions and expert analysis, is a guest co-host, and today, to explore the theme of resilience, I'm delighted to be joined by Liam Foster from WSP in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Tēnā koe, Liam.
Kia ora, Niki. Thanks very much for having me.
Liam's got significant experience in managing storm and surface water and integrated water management studies, and that's the reason that he's joining me as co-host. He's got extensive experience of managing and delivering urban drainage and climate change adaptation services for local planning authorities, the Environment Agency from his time in the UK, and water companies. But I'm going to get Liam to introduce himself.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Trent ngā awa, I whānau mā ahau I Derbyshire. E Yorkshire, no Derby hoki oku tipuna, ke Otatahi aho I noho ana, hei kairakataki hangarau, wai, aho ki, ko Liam Foster aho. Now, that's my pepeha, which is kind of a way of introducing yourself in Te Reo Māori, which is the Maori language. And it kind of effectively tells people about who I am and sharing my connections with the people and the places that are important to me. So in that introduction, I introduced the fact that my river that I affiliate myself with is the Trent, the River Trent running through the Midlands. My ancestry comes from Derbyshire and Yorkshire. My family live in Derby. I now live in Otatahi, which is Christchurch in New Zealand. And I'm a technical principal for water for WSP in New Zealand. And my name is Liam Foster.
And in my experience of being in meetings with yourself and colleagues from Aotearoa, it's very common now to hear Te Reo Māori all of the time in meetings. It's just wonderful. So as my co-host for today's episode, Liam and I are going to listen to our guest interview together, and then we'll discuss his reflections in the context of working in the water sector both in the UK and in Aotearoa. This episode, we're heading to the UK, and we'll hear in a moment from Catherine Wright and Oliver Harmar from the Environment Agency in England. I spoke to them both a couple of days ago on the topic of resilience in relation to flooding. Liam, I'm really looking forward to hearing your international reflections on the approach that's been taken here in England to severe flooding. And I was particularly interested to hear their reflections on the lessons that they learned after the 2019 floods.
You have perceptions which can become the reality. It's not about controlling the story. I just think it's about informing and making sure people have access to the right information.
We always try and learn around media because they again provide a hugely helpful role in doing that warn, inform, and also telling people what we're doing to try and respond.
So Liam, before we hear about the sort of UK response, and in particular the response in England, can you give me a bit of a sense of the situation in Aotearoa in relation to flooding?
Yes, Nikki, I suppose New Zealand, a land that has been influenced heavily by colonialisation and has got a very similar approach to the way it manages its flooding in many ways, but in a lot of ways incredibly different. The key differences effectively are that although there's a civil defence structure and national emergency management structure that is there in place to help deal with emergencies, the coordination around flooding and flood risk management is more down at a sort of a regional government level. So the equivalents of Yorkshire, etc., we have the regions such as Canterbury and Auckland and the Waikato, effectively, which are sort of heavily responsible for the arrangements and the organisation of flooding and flood risk. And then there's also the entities around the territorial local authorities. Now, unlike the UK, we currently have the territorial local authorities that are responsible for delivering water services, so across the three waters, as we call it in New Zealand: water, wastewater and stormwater. And the TLAs generally, with a couple of exceptions up in Auckland and in Wellington, are managed by the territorial local authorities. In Wellington and Auckland, we have sort of more similar occurrences due to, I suppose, massive population, where we have similar water and and wastewater entities in water care in Auckland, servicing the population of Auckland, and Auckland Council look after the stormwater side. So that's a very similar feeling to the UK flood risk sphere.
Tell me a little bit about recent flooding history in New Zealand. What have you experienced?
Okay, so I've been in New Zealand since 2014, having come across from the United Kingdom. New Zealand's very much on that journey of understanding a lot more around the risks and the hazards that New Zealand faces, both currently with the existing population and the existing climate, as well as we all know the future challenges that are ahead of us in terms of increasing urbanisation, the appetite that there is for people to live and settle into New Zealand. And that's presenting the challenges that's putting more and more people at risk and hazard. And historically, we've had plenty of space in New Zealand. Got a population of about 4.5 to 5 million people currently, spread over a country the size that is sort of Great Britain and Ireland plus another island, effectively. We have dense urban areas such as Auckland. Christchurch is our second biggest city at about 400,000 people. It's fairly well spread out. Unfortunately, we've also settled in areas that perhaps, on reflection, are going to cause us some issues. But they were settled for the very obvious reasons about being close to a water source, being close to routes of trade, and certainly in terms of the linking to the tangata whenua, which are the Maori. A lot of the settlement happened along the major routes that Maori used to move between locations as a nomadic existence. Now, that has caused us challenges. Flooding is our greatest natural hazard risk every year, 2 or 3 times per year. And last year, we've seen flooding down in Southland, which has, remember those days pre-COVID, when we had tourists in the country, meant that a lot of our tourists were stranded in and around Milford Sound from some heavy rainfall events that meant the rivers came up and some of the key critical infrastructure was damaged as a result. Through to the back end of the year in 2020 when Napier, a city on the East Cape of New Zealand and North Island, had 220 odd millimetres of rainfall in 24 hours. Causing significant flooding that's is still being felt today, and a number of people are still not back in their homes. And that's the real challenge that New Zealand faces is I suppose the devolved management by local and regional authorities has meant that we're not necessarily getting a full national flood risk picture, and therefore we are responding to event by event rather than necessarily lifting our game in terms of adaptation and resilience and potentially mitigation around it all.
Okay, so time for the big interview in that case. Such interesting timing to record this because we've had so much flooding in the UK that's taken Oliver and Catherine away. We just had Storm Christoph and they were both really heavily involved in the flooding response. So I began by asking them what the last few weeks had been like.
Okay, it's been a really eventful few weeks. We had a bit of flooding over Christmas. We had some very heavy rain around, and sadly we saw quite a few people in East Anglia flooded over Christmas. And then shortly after that, middle of January, along came Storm Christoph. And that brought a really heavy and persistent band of rain right across the country. And that fell on some pretty wet catchments. And so we were then faced with a major national response with government. Really challenging. Coronavirus, a lot of work going on around the country on testing, vaccination. So not only were we concerned about protecting people in their homes from flooding, but also some of the wider things that were going on across government at the time.
So you, both yourself and Oliver, have obviously got roles within the same sphere, but at different scales. So Oliver, more specifically for you within your lens of Yorkshire, how's the last few weeks been and how does that link to the work that Catherine's talked about at a national level?
Yeah, so it's been very, very demanding, Nikki. So we were supposed to be talking 2 weeks ago, and on that particular day we were literally in the thick of Storm Christoph. We were faced with what I can only describe as a really grim, difficult forecast. We have a joint flood forecasting centre with the Met Office, and they were able to provide really good lead time. So we had about 4 or 5 days lead time. And that's so important because it allows our teams across the Environment Agency and our partners who we work with on the ground to gear up and to get ready. That is priceless. But the difficult thing, of course, was that a large area, particularly across Northern England, but also across parts of the Midlands, was put on high alert, what's called an amber level of risk. And it felt like deja vu for us in Yorkshire. So we suffered repeated flooding this time last year. And while we've learnt from that and put a lot extra in place, the additional challenge was, as Catherine says, that given COVID, we were operating largely virtually, apart from our staff on the ground. So we weren't physically co-located in our incident rooms. So that was certainly an additional challenge. Now, thankfully, it ended up being what I describe as a serious near miss, and the communities that we serve were hugely appreciative of our efforts. But just that initial vulnerability around not knowing where it might hit and what might actually happen is quite something.
When this kind of thing happens and you start to gear up, what does that mean in practice for Environment Agency staff across the country? Can you help just shed a bit of light on practically what that means?
We go into incident management mode. We see this whole national structure that gears up, and we scale that to the size of the incident we're facing. And as Oliver was saying, this was a big national incident. That amber warning means a lot to us in terms of the sort of impacts that we could be seeing. And so we scaled up big. We have this concept called think big, act early. So we scaled up big and early to enable us to be ready for that. And I just want to go back to something that Oliver said, which was this felt like a very significant near miss. We saw an awful lot of very large rivers absolutely brimful. In Manchester, for example, in the Didsbury area, we had a flood storage basin that was centimetres away from overspilling, and that could have caused significant more damage.
So help me understand what some of the lessons learned are from that 2019 incident that perhaps you've put into practice when you scaled up. And think big, act early. I like that.
I think the things I would pick out in particular are the opportunities a flood actually presents in terms of those relationships, both with the professional partners that need to work as one team. So we come together around the incident, as Catherine said, at a strategic level and a tactical level, but then also the relationships on the ground with our community flood warden networks. Because obviously after a major flood, and it's truly devastating. If you ever walk into a flooded property, it gets you immediately. It is so traumatic.
Just tell me a little bit more about community flood wardens. How do they work? It's not something I'm aware of.
It's so valuable to have the eyes and ears of what's actually happening, plus people who can spread that warning and informing information, because all incident management is ultimately about partnerships. So for us, we work with flood wardens, representatives of villages, towns, lots of communities across the country, and we will help them understand the kind of service that we can provide, and we'll work with them to see what additionally they can do, particularly to reach out to those more vulnerable members of the community. And to be honest, it's absolutely priceless, and those networks are so important to us.
You talked, Catherine, about your incident management structures, which sound extremely robust. Do you have a sense of vulnerability within that framework? So vulnerable customer groups and individuals. You talked about that through the community flood wardens. Is that seen at a national level as well when you start to think about how you approach these kind of incidents? How do you consider vulnerability?
One of the really big challenges for us during an incident is actually maintaining that situational awareness across the whole country, but be able to do it in the sort of level of detail that is, as Oliver describes, really means something to helping communities, all the way through to pulling that together into a single national situational understanding that allows us to not only know what's happening at that particular point and make decisions, but actually gives us that forward look. So what could happen and where are the really vulnerable locations? Oliver talked about the flood forecasting partnership that we have with the Met Office that has transformed that ability to look ahead. But it also relies on some of our technical know-how around our modelling and forecasting capability that actually can turn those forecasts into what might happen in the different rivers all around and on the coast, all around the country, given whatever the flooding event is. And then the challenge is to turn that then into the local actions and convey all this to the government. And this last Storm Christoph, Cobra was meeting as well. So, you have to provide that reliable information. And so one of the learning points that we had from the winter last year was about how we reach more rural communities. And what we saw this time, we've learnt from that. So we work with some of our national stakeholders like the National Farmers Union, CLA, Association of Drainage Authorities, for example, to feed out national information to their teams, and then they can cascade that out to their local contacts and regional leads.
We're really grateful to our sponsor, Yorkshire Water, for making it possible to bring you this podcast series. If your organisation would like to find out more about sponsoring future episodes or series of Let's Talk WEM, just go to letstalkwem.ciwem.org to get all the information you need. If you could look at the 2019 floods, for example, again, what would you do differently? And I don't necessarily just mean in the incident management itself, but thinking about prior to that incident and post-incident.
I think for me, there are two areas I'd pick out. We live in a 24/7 media age, and flooding, because of all the trauma, becomes headline news very, very quickly. I think what inevitably happens is in the hours and the days following floods, and we see this on social media, you have perceptions which can become the reality. It's not about controlling the story. I just think it's about informing and making sure people have access to the right information. So if I think back to last winter, in the November 29 floods that hit South Yorkshire, we had stories running around, did the £20 million investment that we with partners have made in the Sheffield flood defences, did they make it worse downstream in Doncaster? And also in March 2020, we had a similar story when we had flooding of the Lower Ayrsham villages further north. Did the new investments in Leeds actually contribute to those impacts that we saw? Now, in both cases, we work incredibly hard to make sure that we look at the whole catchment and that any investment in any one particular place does not have an impact downstream. And that's looked at very, very carefully on a case-by-case basis. However, managing that perception in the midst of a big incident and trying to get our messages across can be quite challenging. I think the other area is, obviously so much more in hindsight. But what we put in place between the South Yorkshire floods in November 2019 and what we've just been through was more rigorous incident plans with our partners. So at a community, at a tactical and at a strategic levels, the whole of South Yorkshire, we knew our triggers more clearly, and based on the experience of what happened first time around, we had clearer roles and a clearer plan of action, and that's so important.
Coming back to some of the big learnings nationally, yes, working together, absolutely vital. Actually, it also showed us that investment, albeit that there were some concerns that Oliver said, we know that the investment did work. We saw the 5th wettest winter on record last winter, the wettest ever February. And yet we were able to protect lots and lots of people through the investment that's gone into flood defences. And we were able to protect people and stop them from flooding. But I think there was a big sea change in the narrative last winter. Climate change is more and more in the news. And of course, the sad truth is that we can't prevent all flooding in all places all of the time. And I will say one final thing about media, because again, we always try and learn around media, because they again provide a hugely helpful role in doing that warn, inform, and also telling people what we're doing to try and respond to the incident. And actually, we learnt from that when we came back to Christoph, whereas Oliver said we did have that lead-in time from the weather forecasts to say something big was coming. We were able to work with the media very proactively at the front end of that to start this process of warning and informing and sort of readying the country, if you like.
You beautifully segue, Catherine, into thinking about what does the future look like? What does the climate and ecological emergency mean for the Environment Agency?
So I think there's a number of aspects to it. So the first thing is mitigation. I'm hugely conscious in this role that pouring concrete to build new defences adds carbon to the atmosphere. So we need to look at ways about how we can do those defences, but do it in a way that uses less carbon. But the second part of it, because we are locked into climate change, is to being aware of those impacts, what they're going to be, and to start planning now. And in our work around flood risk, that means being ready to deal with what potentially could be a metre of sea level rise around the coast by the end of the century, and actually significantly wetter rainfall events in much more intense rain. So our rivers having to deal with, more water coming down them in short, sharp bursts. Surface water in urban areas experiencing flooding on a wider scale. But also drought and dry weather. And that matters because we have to think about water in a joined up way. But that drying and wetting that we're seeing also puts strain on the sort of defences that we know are so important to being resilient to climate change. So it's really shifting the thinking now to resilience. So this is about how you plan, yes, how you protect and defend, but then when flooding does happen, how you respond and recover quickly, and then build in resilience to all of our infrastructure, to homes, to businesses.
Climate change is happening and it's here. A 1.5 degrees C temperature rise is to some extent locked in. There's a degree of inevitability. I think the real step change locally is that we are working with partners who understand this and see it as a major strategic priority for themselves. We've now got a group with local authority partners at a senior level looking across the River Don catchment at, what might be both the future engineering that we need, but crucially, how do you slow the flow? How do you create space for water through using nature and other solutions across the whole catchment in tandem with engineered solutions? And then how do you engage communities at risk in a different way and help them understand what they can do so that we're all better prepared and can live with the risk, as well as respond and recover from it quickly, as Catherine mentioned.
One of the things, and I would say this because my background is in ops and I can't shake it, I'm sorry, all of this takes cash. Sometimes it's easy to get money to build new things, but it's difficult to get money to maintain existing things. So from your perspective, we talk about this being a priority for communities, but does it feel like that's backed up with funding?
The great news is in March last year, we had the budget announcement for the next 6 years. Starting from April this year, we'll be starting a new capital programme. It's great, it's doubled the funding. We're also making the case strongly for funding for maintenance because our asset base is growing. Because of climate change and this wetting and drying, and the fact that our defences are under more pressure because of the extent to which they're being operated, because we're seeing those climate impacts now. We know that maintenance funding is hugely important. Now we're just waiting to sort of get the final settlement from the 2020 spending review, which because of coronavirus is going to be a 1-year settlement. But what we're continuing to do is to work with government to make that case very, very strongly for a longer term settlement on maintenance that actually takes into account those extra stresses and strains that we are seeing on our defences. So we'll continue to maintain defences. It's a vital part of what we do, and we're going to continue to make the case to government that actually we need that to reflect the climate risk.
Often with the nature-based solutions, the maintenance requirements are quite different and probably less extensive in some respects. And what we heard with Living with Water was around community resilience and community rain tanks, and you start to spread the risk a little bit, I think, more with those kind of approaches. So therefore, economically, it feels like a sensible approach as well to take.
They are fantastic, and there are some brilliant nature-based solutions. And as we develop these ideas, we'll also have to think about property level resilience needs maintaining, and people need to know how to operate it and make it work. And if you move house, you've got to know what you're doing. There are some challenges in there, but maintenance will be a vital part of it.
If I just comment on nature-based solutions, which across Yorkshire gain such traction when you talk to communities that are on the front line of flood risk and climate change, planting trees, be it creating wetland areas or ponds, a whole range of features. The great thing about more natural solutions is that local people can volunteer and get involved. And if I look at and think about the package of work we have going on in the Upper Calder Valley, the Calder, a set of communities that have suffered repeated flooding in the last decade, that has been quite an inspiring programme to help local people be able to do something themselves and complement the work that the Environment Agency is delivering and sponsoring. And I think that overall package of co-delivery is so important going forward. One of the few benefits of the pandemic has been that people have become even more connected with what's going on around them. That sense of I can do something, yes, for flood, but also that has benefits for water quality, for carbon storage, for them and their families and friends to access and be part of, the natural landscape. I think we've seen that be so important over the last 12 months, and I'm sure that's a trend that's only going to grow.
I think you're right, people are definitely connecting with landscape even more than they probably have done. And your message about community and the power of community, Catherine, is also really inspiring. There is definitely something about hope there, I think. It would be remiss of me not to ask you to do what I ask everybody to do on this podcast, which is to see if we can make a connection between what we've just been talking about and where we're heading next. The next pod, we are heading to Nepal, and we're speaking with Tripti Rai, who is the WaterAid Country Director there. And they are working on a project in conjunction with Anglian Water called the Beacon Project, where they're skills sharing to try and improve the water and sanitation and hygiene outcomes within a region within Nepal.
I'll have a go. When we look at countries that are on different stages of the journey towards water resilience, we have a huge amount to learn. We've built our way out of a lot of our problems. We have become less connected with the environment and nature. And I think the fantastic opportunity of working in a place like Nepal is what we can learn about reconnecting people with nature and their environment, and working with the environment to have more innovative solutions to water. We have to be open to bringing in ideas from all over the world, because this is a global challenge.
My connection is even more basic in a sense. Skill sharing and partnerships, that is the core ingredient of good instant response. It's also the core ingredient of good working in places like Nepal through organisations like WaterAid. It's all about partnerships and it's all about sharing.
Well, not too tenuous at all. Perfect links. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to me today.
Thanks, Niki.
Thanks, Niki.
OK, so Liam, what did you think?
Oh, Niki, it was really interesting, wasn't it? I mean, it makes you really reflect and look back. I remember being obviously in the country, living through the 2007 floods, going through the pit report, and then helping clients from local authorities with surface water management plans and the Environment Agency around some of the schemes in the Midlands, and just listening to the way Oliver and Catherine have described how the response went to 2019 and even 2020, just how far we've come. It's been 10 years in the making to get to this point, probably since the pit report started to hit, and obviously the transition of responsibilities across the lead local flood authorities in England. But really, really proud. And I think that one of the key takeaways there is that the nation as a whole is a lot more resilient. Yes, we're still making some silly mistakes, right? We're still building in places that probably we shouldn't be building in, and that goes to New Zealand as well. But just listening to the bit about the community involvement, the nature-based solutions, planning around adaptation and mitigation for the future climate and building back better is just fantastic. And I really like that, right at the beginning, Catherine mentioned around think big and act early in terms of how to prepare for and manage an event during occurrence. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have to prepare to get people out of the way and protect their property, because we'll have used good spatial planning to avoid that from happening. But we've settled in these places for very strong reasons in the past, so we have to live with what we've got.
So from what you've heard, Liam, how much of that rings true for the flooding events that you've talked about that have happened within New Zealand in the last few years? What are the similarities?
I have a sense of envy. So that coordinated response is, I suppose, a little bit missing within the New Zealand context. There's a thirst for us to move in that direction. Communities are becoming more and more upset by these things happening because of the impact it has on their mental well-being, the economic impact and the environmental damage and degradation that flooding can cause. That obviously starts to drive the agenda. We have a couple of other challenges within New Zealand. As mentioned before, we're a small population. We haven't really got the luxury of huge amounts of cash to invest in protecting everybody. Have those conversations about how we can live with water, how we're going to adapt to that future climate, but from a different starting point that you are in England with the Environment Agency information and position. I mean, we've only just this year got some funding from central government to undertake a national flood risk mapping framework. We're just starting to get into that overall understanding around what the national flood risk exposure is, and that will lead us to a position where we suddenly realise how actually vulnerable we are to the flooding. If you think about the journey that the United Kingdom went through in terms of, we knew how exposed we were to main rivers from the Environment Agency data set, and then 2007 happened and all of a sudden surface water or pluvial flooding became significantly more in the lexicon. That's exactly where we are now following Napier, for example. And we've got the other challenges of incredibly diverse topography. We've got big catchments and big rivers. I mean, one of the key things that was astounding to me when I arrived over here and started working in New Zealand was the scale of the rivers and the flows. So I remember hearing stories around peak flows within the Thames being at about 450 cumecs. We've got rivers here that are 2,500 to 4,500 cumecs, thundering past urban environments, and you can't engineer your way out of that. So therefore you have to live and adapt to it. And most of the cities around coast, river deltas, therefore have had to live and adapt to them. It's becoming more and more apparent that we're not as accepting as we used to be.
So we're hearing quite a lot, aren't we, about natural flood risk management, and certainly Oliver talked about making space for water. Episode 2, we talked about living with water. Is that something that you're talking about within the New Zealand context?
To a certain extent, but it's not badged as such. I mean, we're blessed with quite a big country to actually make sure that we do avoid bad decisions in terms of development. It's really interesting, I suppose, you touch on COVID and you touch on the nature-based solutions and the connectivity between people and the environment. We certainly felt that within the COVID experience in New Zealand with the heavy lockdown right at the beginning of March, April 2020, and even the government response. The government response has been to put a lot of funding into this thing called Jobs for Nature, native tree planting, creating jobs to work in and around the catchments and environments. But it's not in a coordinated manner. And I suppose it's not making that specific link that we're doing this because it will have an impact on our flood risk downstream. We haven't made those connections per se. We're doing this because it's the right thing to do. We know we need to do this in terms of our decarbonisation journey as part of the climate emergency that we all face. It's got a dual benefit to it all, but it'd be really interesting to see if we could make that link to a demonstrable benefit in terms of the way our catchments respond to flooding.
One thing that I'm slightly aware of in New Zealand is the relationship between people and the water. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that, because I think that's very different to the UK and really interesting.
The approaches of colonialisation and urbanisation has had a huge and damaging impact upon our natural and water environments. That is in direct conflict, I suppose, with the Maori worldview. And the Maori worldview is effectively that water is the life force of people, of their culture. So much so that legislation has come to fruition across New Zealand on a thing called Te Mana Atawai. And Te Mana Atawai is put the health of the waterway first. Secondary concern is how the waterway can sustain life. And then thirdly, how you can then yield some form of economical social value from the waterway. And remember that in New Zealand we've a legal body in some of our watercourses, such as the Wanganui River up on the North Island. It's a legal entity, so it has a legal status. Bad behaviour effectively within that catchment can be prosecuted, because you're affecting a living body.
Liam, it's so interesting to hear you speak about this. I mean, certainly in the UK, just before Christmas up here in Yorkshire, a stretch of the River Wharfe being designated as the first inland bathing water. There's a huge amount of interest in that and what might transpire on the back of that. It's not the same by any stretch, but it's really interesting to hear how you've sort of turned it on its head, really, and you're putting the health of the waterway as the priority. There are lots of similarities, but the differences are beautiful as well, and it's really lovely to hear them. So thank you for exploring them with me. Before we go, you know the drill now. This is episode 4. We try and find a link between our episodes. And as you heard Catherine and Oliver talking about, we're heading to Nepal next and to think about the Beacon Project, which is a partnership between WaterAid and Anglian Water. Can you find any links from your experiences to where we're going next?
Yes, certainly can. Well, WaterAid, I suppose, is one of the charities and organisations that I really do affiliate with. The ability to work on the UN Sustainable Development Goals around water and sanitation and access to clean water and sanitation across the world is very important to me. And we've got a number of our staff from WSP in New Zealand who are doing similar ventures for Engineers Without Borders, kind of a similar entity. One of my colleagues has just recently returned from Kiribati, putting in some solar water filtration devices to enable the island nation of Kiribati to have safe drinking water, because it's a saline intrusion occurring within their groundwater. So definite links there, and I really advocate for anybody to get involved in WaterAid, because it's a great organisation.
I am very much looking forward to talking to Tripti Rai, who's the country director over there. That'll be next episode. I'm going to be joined by Neil Jewis as my co-host, who's the director of water service delivery at Yorkshire Water. I'm getting subtly told that actually the Everything is Connected theme is mainly just Yorkshire. I promise you it's not, but there is a bit of Yorkshire going on. So don't forget to subscribe to the pod, which you can do on your favourite podcast player so you don't miss an episode. It just leaves me to say, Liam, a huge thank you, and thanks to my wonderful guests, Oliver and Catherine as well. That's it, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Let's Talk WEM is produced by Bwlb. BWLB Bwlb. The best ideas, the strongest content.